Let's talk about the paradox of space, the kind we create when we go no contact with someone who's avoidant. When we think of addiction, we often picture craving, compulsion, and lack of control. But emotional addiction, that's quieter. It's a whisper that grows louder in silence. And avoidance, those who run from intimacy the fastest, often feel that pull the strongest after you've gone quiet. We live in a culture that celebrates independence. The ability to handle it on your own is worn like a badge of honor. For avoidantly attached people, this message doesn't just resonate, it becomes gospel. Independence isn't just a lifestyle for them, it becomes their emotional survival strategy. They learn early, sometimes in childhood, sometimes through heartbreak, that to need is to risk. So they choose the safer path, needing no one. But this independence, it's not always what it seems. What looks like self-sufficiency from the outside is often a carefully constructed fortress designed to keep others at a distance. It's not that avoidants don't want love. They do, deeply. They crave connection, intimacy, warmth. But the vulnerability required to receive those things feels overwhelming. So instead, they opt out. They say, I'm fine on my own, not because it's true, but because it feels safer than the alternative. There's a particular loneliness that comes with that kind of independence. Not the kind where no one is around, but the kind where you're surrounded by people and still feel unseen. Avoidants often don't even realize how much they're holding in, how much effort it takes to constantly downplay their own needs. It's like holding your breath underwater for years. Eventually, your lungs start to ache, even if you're smiling on the surface. What's tricky is that this independence gets reinforced. Friends admire them for being low maintenance. Partners might initially be attracted to their self-assuredness, their ability to give space. And the avoidant clings to that praise because it confirms their strategy is working. They tell themselves, see, this is what people want, not neediness, not messiness. Just calm, cool, and collected. But inside, there's often a quiet desperation, a longing to be loved without having to perform for it. Avoidants don't avoid because they don't care. They avoid because they care too much, and caring feels dangerous. Every emotional bid feels like a gamble. What if I show you I need you and you leave? What if I lean on you and you disappear? So instead of risking rejection, they armor up. They tell themselves they're better off alone, that no one ever really shows up anyway, that independence is the only guarantee. But here's the hard truth. Independence becomes a prison when it's used to escape intimacy. True freedom isn't needing no one. It's knowing that you can need someone and still be okay. That you can be held and still be whole. That letting someone in doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. For avoidants, that lesson often doesn't land until someone they care about finally stops reaching. When the consistent partner, the one who tried to connect again and again, eventually goes silent, that's when the illusion starts to crack. The independence that once felt like strength starts to feel like isolation. And in that stillness, they begin to feel the weight of everything they pushed away, the love they didn't know how to receive, the help they never asked for, the closeness they secretly longed for. So when we talk about avoidance becoming addicted after no contact, we're not talking about manipulation or games. We're talking about emotional truths breaking through old defenses. The illusion of independence shatters when real loss enters the room. And what's left isn't weakness. It's the beginning of honesty. Let me know if you want this formatted for a blog, article, or video script. I can tweak the flow depending on where. The trigger of silence. Silence is a powerful thing. On the surface, it might seem like just a lack of communication, a simple pause in the usual rhythm of interaction. But for someone with avoidant attachment, silence is far from neutral. It becomes a trigger. It's not just the absence of words or touch, but a moment that stirs deep hidden fears, fears that they've carefully avoided confronting for a long time. And when you go silent, it acts like a mirror reflecting back their most primal anxieties, the fear of abandonment, of not being enough, of losing the connection they didn't know how to nurture. For the avoidant, silence isn't a void, it's a vacuum. It's the emotional equivalent of holding your breath, waiting to see if someone will show up or leave. When there's no contact, they're left with their own thoughts. And that's a scary place. Because in the quiet, all the things they've been pushing down, the insecurities, the doubts, the fears, start to resurface. Suddenly they're faced with a version of themselves they've been trying to outrun. It's in that silence that they begin to question whether they were ever really wanted at all. It's crucial to understand that for avoidance, the fear of abandonment runs deep. Many avoidants learned early in life that it's safer to distance themselves emotionally from others rather than risk the heartbreak of being left behind. They might have experienced neglect, emotional unavailability, or even just subtle cues that their needs were too much for others. Over time, they learn to cope by pushing people away before anyone could hurt them. But this coping mechanism doesn't erase the wound. It just buries it under layers of emotional armor. And when silence enters the equation, that armor starts to crack. When you stop reaching out, when you pull away, it doesn't just feel like you're stepping back. It feels like abandonment. And for the avoidant, abandonment isn't just an event, it's a narrative they've carried for so long that it becomes self-fulfilling. They expect to be left, so when silence falls, it feels like proof that they were right all along. The thing they fear most, the thing they've been running from, has finally come to pass. This isn't about you, it's about them. Confronting a story they've been telling themselves for years. If I let someone in, they will leave. They always do. In the silence, avoidants may also feel a sense of powerlessness. Their usual defense mechanism is to keep emotional distance, to be the one who controls the flow of affection. They're used to deciding when they're available and when they're not. But when you step back, when you stop pursuing, they lose that control. They're left in a space where they don't get to call the shots, and that's disorienting. The emotional rules they've relied on, rules that keep them safe, are suddenly thrown into chaos. This is where the addiction to silence begins. It's not the absence of contact that they crave, but the sense of control they feel when they're the ones left alone with their thoughts. They start to replay your absence over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out why you pulled away. In this process, they begin to build a story, one where they tell themselves that you were the one who left. They detach from the truth in order to protect their own narrative, that they are the one in control, that they were right to push you away. This mental loop becomes an emotional trap, one where silence feeds their uncertainty and makes them yearn for something that feels safe, distance. The longer the silence persists, the more they become consumed by it. It's no longer just about the absence of contact. It's about their fear of abandonment being triggered in the most profound way. Their emotional walls begin to weaken. They start to crave the very connection they once ran from, but they don't know how to reach for it without feeling vulnerable. The silence forces them to confront what they've always feared. That real connection means surrendering control, and that scares them more than anything else. In this space, something transformative can begin to happen. The avoidant may start to realize that silence isn't the same as rejection. They may come to understand that true intimacy doesn't happen in the absence of fear, but in the presence of it. That vulnerability, something they've avoided for so long, isn't the weakness they thought it was, but a pathway to deeper connection. The silence that once felt like abandonment can become an invitation to face their deepest wounds, to heal the parts of themselves that long for love but fear it too much to let in. So the trigger of silence isn't just the absence of words. It's the beginning of a process, an emotional journey, where An avoidant is forced to confront the truths they've kept buried. And while the path may be uncomfortable, it's also the opportunity for something beautiful, a shift from isolation to connection, from fear to courage, and from silence to understanding. Emotional object permanence. Emotional object permanence is a concept that we usually associate with young children. It's the idea that when a person or object is out of sight, it still exists in the mind. As adults, we often take this for granted. We know that just because someone is no longer in our immediate field of vision doesn't mean they've disappeared. But for avoidance, the idea of emotional object permanence operates differently. When they can't see or feel someone close, it doesn't mean you're forgotten. It often means the obsession intensifies. The absence doesn't erase you, it magnifies you. For avoidance, the initial feeling of distance can feel like relief. The space created by no contact or physical absence is often interpreted as a retreat to safety, a place where they can regain control of their emotions and avoid feeling vulnerable. The space provides them with the illusion of control over their feelings and the situation. But as time passes, that very absence begins to stir something deeper in their psyche. What once felt like a shield becomes a reminder, a nagging reminder that something important has been lost or is missing. Unlike the secure person who can feel comforted by the knowledge that someone is thinking of them even when they aren't in sight, an avoidance emotional response to absence is different. For them, the absence triggers a reaction, something akin to panic. When you're not around, they may begin to wonder, did you really care about them? Why haven't you reached out? Have they made a mistake in pushing you away? The absence forces them to confront the emotions they've been running from, and rather than forget you, they obsess over the void you left. This is a fascinating paradox. While avoidance is a defense mechanism against vulnerability, the distance only brings their vulnerability into sharper focus. For someone who fears being emotionally overwhelmed or consumed by another person, the very silence or distance they create can trigger a flood of thoughts and worries. They begin to replay every interaction in their mind, second-guessing every word, every moment. They start to focus on the absence itself, and in doing so, you become even more present in their thoughts than you ever were when they could feel you nearby. Emotional object permanence for avoidance doesn't mean out of sight, out of mind. Instead, it means out of sight, and now I have all the space I need to let my fears take center stage. They often interpret your absence as an abandonment, even if it's self-imposed. And the longer the silence lasts, the more the absence grows into something almost larger than life. The mind starts to fill the space left behind with worst-case scenario. They obsess over what might have gone wrong or what they might have done to push you away, even if they can't consciously acknowledge that this behavior is rooted in fear. The silence also exacerbates their internal conflict. They wanted distance because they were overwhelmed by the potential of emotional intimacy, but now that you're gone, they feel an emptiness they hadn't anticipated. They are torn between wanting to keep you at a safe distance and longing to reconnect in a way that doesn't force them to face their vulnerability. The silence feels like a puzzle they can't solve. It's as if they're left to piece together a fractured connection they're afraid of fully engaging with, yet can't seem to stop thinking about. The paradox is that in the absence of contact, they're often more emotionally consumed than when they were interacting with you. In this mental and emotional state, avoidants begin to experience something akin to emotional obsession. The space between you becomes filled with uncertainty, and that uncertainty breeds anxiety. The more they try to push you out of their mind, the more they find themselves drawn back to thoughts of you. Their attachment grows not in a healthy, balanced way, but in a way that's colored by insecurity and fear of abandonment. They may replay texts, conversations, and moments in their head, analyzing everything, trying to understand what went wrong or if they've lost something they can't retrieve. They become fixated on you, but not in a straightforward, open way. Instead, it's a constant cycle of pushing and pulling. What's important to recognize here is that this emotional obsession isn't the same as healthy longing or desire for closeness. It's distorted by their fear of emotional engulfment, abandonment, and rejection. Their need for space, which originally served as a protective mechanism, has turned into a source of anxiety. It's like they've set up an emotional wall, only to have the absence of contact create a vacuum that pulls them toward thoughts of you in a way they can't control. This cycle can often be confusing to both them and to you because they may act distant, but their mind is often circling around you, unable to escape the emotional pull. Eventually, for avoidance, the absence becomes so loud that they can no longer ignore it. This is where the turning point can happen. The silence they initially embraced and found comfort in suddenly becomes uncomfortable. They begin to realize that the distance they created has only deepened their emotional attachment in ways they didn't expect. The absence of connection doesn't result in them forgetting about you or moving on. It leads to a stronger, more intense fixation. When you're out of sight, you're no longer just out of mind. You've become the center of their internal world, whether they like it or not. In this expanded version, the idea that emotional object permanence for avoidance leads to obsession rather than peace is explored. Their emotional distance paradoxically draws them closer to thoughts of you, feeding into their fear of abandonment and deepening their attachment in a way that's hard for them to manage. Let me know if you'd like any adjustments or further exploration into any particular area. Control and craving. For many avoidants, emotional distance doesn't create the space for clarity or emotional peace. It creates a craving. But this craving isn't for connection or intimacy in the traditional sense. It's a craving for control over the emotional narrative. When they pull away, they don't necessarily seek to sever ties or avoid feeling. What they want is the ability to dictate the emotional terms of the relationship, terms that allow them to feel safe without feeling vulnerable. In their world, control over the emotional dynamics of a relationship is more important than the closeness that might come from mutual connection. At first, the distance may feel like relief, a break from the emotional intensity they struggle to cope with. For avoidance, emotions are overwhelming. They fear being consumed by another person's needs and expectations. So when they create distance, it serves as a protective barrier, giving them space to breathe. But the paradox of this space is that it quickly becomes less about the freedom to feel safe and more about the ability to control the emotional narrative. Instead of allowing a natural connection to develop, they use distance as a tool to maintain control over the flow of emotions. This craving for control can be seen in how avoidants handle the ebb and flow of intimacy. They don't simply seek emotional closeness in the way someone with a secure attachment might. Instead, they want to control the timing, the pace, and the level of vulnerability they allow themselves to experience. When they create distance, it's not just a simple withdrawal. It's an attempt to maintain the upper hand in the emotional exchange. They don't want to be swept away by feelings. They want to control when and how they engage. Distance allows them to step back and decide when they are ready to emotionally invest, giving them the illusion of autonomy and safety. But here's the catch. The craving for control can be intoxicating. The more they control the narrative, the more they feel emotionally safe, at least in the short term. But over time, this need for control becomes insatiable. They may start to crave more distance because the absence allows them to dictate the terms of their emotional world without feeling pressured to expose their vulnerabilities. Every time they pull away, they regain a sense of power over their emotions, and that sense of power becomes an addictive feeling. What starts as a coping mechanism gradually morphs into a craving for the emotional security that comes with control. As the silence deepens, avoidants begin to experience an emotional paradox. On one hand, they long for connection, but on the other, they feel compelled to control every aspect of that connection. They may find themselves torn between wanting to open up to you and needing to keep their guard up, ensuring that they never lose control of the situation. This inner tension creates a push and pull dynamic in which they crave the emotional closeness but fear the potential loss of control. In this sense, the craving is not just for intimacy, but for the ability to remain in charge of how deep that intimacy goes. Control for an avoidant often feels like the only way to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm. When they crave emotional distance, they crave the ability to dictate how much of themselves they allow to be seen. When you're present in their life, they feel exposed. When you're not, they feel safe. But the safety they experience in this absence is an illusion. It's a temporary emotional refuge that doesn't solve the underlying issues of vulnerability and trust. Eventually, the craving for control becomes so strong that it distorts their understanding of what intimacy should be. They start to equate control with emotional safety, even though the true emotional safety they seek can only come from connection, not isolation. The intensity of this craving for control becomes particularly evident when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. Instead of confronting their emotions and allowing themselves to experience the depth of their feelings, they retreat into control. Distance at this point becomes the only thing that feels manageable. It's not that they don't want you to reach out, it's that they're not ready to give up their emotional power. Every attempt to reestablish contact feels like a potential threat to the control they've carefully constructed. This cycle can become incredibly frustrating for both them and for you because the craving for emotional security remains unmet, and the more they retreat into control, the further they push you away. In a relationship where distance has been established, the craving for control may not be as visible as an outright need for space. It can look more like emotional pushback or subtle resistance to deeper connection. Avoidants will often guard their hearts with layers of defense, but these defenses aren't invincible. Eventually, the craving for real connection starts to seep through. They may find themselves questioning the very walls they've built. And when the emotional control they've clung to begins to feel like a cage, the craving for authentic emotional intimacy might surface. Yet they struggle to reconcile this craving with their deep-rooted fear of losing control. It's in this tension between control and connection that many avoidants get stuck. The key takeaway here is that for avoidance, the desire for control is often mistaken for the desire for emotional intimacy. What they crave isn't simply love or closeness, it's the emotional safety that comes from dictating the terms of that closeness. The need for control masks their deeper need for connection, and the emotional distance they create becomes a way to protect themselves from the very vulnerability that intimacy requires. Over time, this craving for control can become so powerful that it eclipses their ability to experience the deep emotional rewards that come with genuine intimacy. And in that sense, what they crave most isn't freedom from connection, but freedom from feeling overwhelmed by their own emotions. In this expanded version, the craving for control is explored in depth, showing how it becomes an emotionally addictive response for avoidance, often overshadowing their desire for genuine connection. This craving becomes a coping mechanism to manage emotional vulnerability, but it ultimately reinforces emotional distance. Let me know if you'd like any further changes or focus on specific areas. In the world of emotional avoidance, distance is often equated with safety. For avoidance, pulling away or creating space isn't just about seeking solitude. It's about regaining control over their emotions. The quiet, the absence, the silence, these are the things that allow them to feel safe from the overwhelming potential of intimacy. At first, it feels like a refuge, like a protective barrier that keeps them from being consumed by someone else's needs, feelings, and expectations. But what avoidants often don't anticipate is the vulnerability hangover that follows the absence, the deep, unrelenting feeling of loss that settles in when the distance is no longer a sanctuary, but a painful reminder of what's been pushed away. When they've distanced themselves long enough, there's an initial sense of relief. It feels as though they've regained control over the emotional landscape of their lives. The absence is welcomed because it offers a break from the uncertainty and intensity of emotional connection. For a while, they might even believe that they are better off this way, that keeping others at arm's length is the solution to their fears of being overwhelmed or abandoned. But as time passes, something shifts. What once felt like a safe distance now begins to feel like something else, like a void, an emptiness that can no longer be ignored. This shift happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The very space that once felt like freedom now starts to feel like isolation. The silence that once protected them starts to feel cold. In the quiet, they begin to hear the echo of the connection they walked away from. The protective layers they've built up against vulnerability no longer serve as a shield, but as a constant reminder of what they've lost. The emotional walls they so carefully constructed now begin to feel less like safety and more like confinement. What was once an act of self-preservation becomes an emotional prison, and the realization hits. Distance doesn't provide the security they thought it would. It only amplifies the emptiness they tried to avoid. For avoidants, this is a painful and disorienting experience. They may find themselves unable to ignore the emotional dissonance between what they thought they wanted, space, autonomy, control, and what they now feel they're missing, connection, warmth, intimacy. The emotional hangover sets in. They can no longer deny the deep ache of loss because the very absence that once felt like peace now feels like an emotional vacuum. The craving for closeness grows, but so does the fear of getting too close. They realize they have been running from something far deeper than they were willing to acknowledge. Fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen, fear of needing someone. And now, in the absence of contact, that fear has manifested into something they can no longer push aside. This vulnerability hangover is particularly jarring because it forces them to confront emotions they've been suppressing. The emotional space they thought would protect them from their feelings instead forces them to reckon with the truth of what they've been avoiding. Their desire for connection and their fear of it are not as easily separated as they once believed. When they pull away, they don't just create physical distance, they create emotional distance. But when the emotional distance grows too wide, they can no longer pretend that they don't feel the absence. They begin to recognize that avoiding vulnerability isn't the same as avoiding pain. In fact, in many ways, it only intensifies the pain in the long run. What makes the vulnerability hangover particularly complex for avoidants is the inner conflict it creates. They may feel an overwhelming desire to reach out, to reconnect, but their fear of being consumed by another person's needs or emotions holds them back. There's a part of them that craves closeness, yet they hesitate because they've convinced themselves that closeness means losing themselves in someone else's world. They fear that if they let you back in, they will once again be overwhelmed by the need to protect themselves from emotional entanglement. This inner tug of war only exacerbates the vulnerability hangover. They long for intimacy, but fear what it may cost them, and so they remain stuck in a painful paradox, unsure of how to move forward. Over time, the emotional void that comes from no contact continues to reverberate in their consciousness. They begin to notice the places where the silence once felt like a relief now feel like a sharp absence, an emotional gap that cannot be filled by anything other than connection. Yet the longer they remain in this space of avoidance, the more their longing grows. They crave intimacy, but they're also afraid of it. And the longer they wait to address this conflict, the more it festers, leaving them with a sense of emotional hangover that refuses to go away. Eventually, many avoidants will begin to see that the vulnerability hangover isn't something that can be cured by simply pulling away again. They start to realize that the very distance they've relied on to protect themselves is the thing that's keeping them from experiencing the emotional intimacy they crave. They may come to understand that avoiding vulnerability doesn't give them the freedom they desire. It only keeps them trapped in a cycle of emotional avoidance where the pain of loss continues to rise each time they try to numb it. The vulnerability hangover is a painful reminder that true emotional freedom doesn't come from distance, it comes from embracing vulnerability and connection. In this way, the vulnerability hangover can serve as a turning point. It's not just a moment of pain, but a wake-up call, an opportunity to reflect on what they really need and want. The discomfort of this hangover signals a shift from emotional isolation to emotional honesty. It's in this space that the avoidant can begin to move toward healing, recognizing that the fear of vulnerability is not something to run from, but something to embrace. They may not be able to fully eliminate the fear, but they can begin to reframe it as an invitation to lean into the connections that will help them grow rather than retreating into the safety of distance. In this expanded version, the experience of the vulnerability hangover is explored in depth. It shows how the initial sense of safety that distance provides for avoidance eventually transforms into a painful recognition of loss. The emotional consequences of avoidance finally catch up with them, and the craving for connection becomes undeniable, even though the fear of vulnerability still holds them back. Let me know if you'd like further adjustments or additions.